Well, the unemployment numbers came out last Friday. Are they real? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Good afternoon. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. I do have a line open. The number to call is 1-877-913-5357. 1-877-913-5357. You can also go to the website at www.prudentmoney.com. Send a question into the Ask Bob section, and I will get you taken care of. A lot of people do that. Love to hear from you, so go check it out at prudentmoney.com. 1-877-913-5357. Well, last Friday, excuse me, which is the first Friday of the month, we get the unemployment numbers. They come out. You have to excuse me, I have problems with my voice today. And it's always an adventure with the unemployment numbers because first of all, and we've talked about this before, the number itself is rarely, in my opinion, very inaccurate of what's really going on. Then they also have the ability to take whatever their 60,000 person survey, 60,000 out of I think the population is 327 million people in this country. Okay, some of those 327 million, obviously a percentage don't work. We're talking about 60,000 though as a representative. And of course I get it. There's no way you can publish that number on a monthly basis without a smaller sample size. But it's just the way that if you ever sat down and read the methodology of how they go about counting jobs, it just doesn't make any sense. So last Friday, the government announced that the economy created 372,000 jobs. Now, I did not take the opportunity to go back and look how many times we've had a job number like that of over 300,000. The 372,000 jobs is a huge, huge employment number. And it begs the question, is the job market that strong? So I went through, and I posted this on prudentmoney.com. You can go check it out. The following numbers. And now it begs the question, does this look like an economy that can produce 372,000 new jobs? Now keep in mind that once you release a number like that, hits the headlines of all the financial media. Of course, financial media, they don't question it because it comes from the government. Go figure why they wouldn't question it, but they don't question the number. Then you have the politicians talking up the number. You have the White House talking up the number. And then you've got financial online media and TV and radio. Everybody's just clapping for the 372,000 jobs. Here's the first little piece of evidence that suggests to me that there's no way that we added 372,000 jobs. Reuters reported the number of Americans filing new claims for unemployment benefit unexpectedly rose just last week, and demand for labor is slowing, with layoffs surging to a 16-month high in June, as aggressive monetary policy tightening from the Federal Reserve stokes recession fears. So layoffs surging to a 16-month high in June, where 372,000 new jobs were created, or quote unquote. The second little piece of evidence first quarter economic growth was estimated to be over 1%. So before they released the actual growth of the first 3 months of the year of the economy, all the economists get together, and I can't remember if it was 1.4 or 1.3. It was over 1%. You'll get the idea. And so there was a positive growth gain. Now remember, when two quarterly declines in economic growth appear, that means we're in a recession. So the first quarter would be negative, the second quarter would be negative, or the second and third quarter would be negative, or the third and fourth quarter would be negative. And that means we're in a recession. So you have all the economists very positive about the growth number. It comes out at a negative 1.5%. Negative 1.5%. And there is a real good chance that we're going to get another negative. And let me back up and say this before I keep going on, now that I think about it. The fact that every economist, and whatever they're following, would suggest that, and I believe it was like 1.6%, something like that, was going to be the growth of the economy. And for them to miss it that bad, I mean, there's a 3.1 differential between 1.6 and negative 1.5, or 1.6, negative 1.6. For those amount of economists to miss that number should have been a huge wake-up call for everybody who follows economic numbers and makes decisions based on economic numbers, like small business people who hire new employees. So the next quarterly number is coming out at the end of this month. Good chance it's going to be negative. What happens in times of recession, or even thoughts of times of recession, is not a big hiring wave. Employers tend to not hire. In fact, they tend to kind of sit back, look at the potential impact of a recession. And if the recession does happen and it plays out, what does that really mean? They don't want to take on extra cost, because if a recession is playing out, that means that consumers are not really spending money like they were. So if you're a consumer-driven business, which every business is a consumer-driven business, right? Then the last thing you're going to do is go and hire for the expectation of big gains in the future. So that's a problem. But yeah, we supposedly added 372,000 jobs. Inflation, as you know, is at a 40-year high. And I don't need to tell you this. I go to the grocery store on Saturday, and my list was a little bit smaller than normal. So I'm excited at the possibilities of having a lower grocery bill. Not only was the grocery bill higher, I mean, it was just a little bit higher than it normally is, and I bought less food. So much for that. But inflation, I believe, is taking it's taking an obvious bite out of consumer spending. And any numbers that show that differently could not be accurate. The problem with consumer spending is that makes up 2/3 of economic growth. So if economic growth is negative 1.5%, and if inflation is climbing, and like I said the other day, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, inflation doesn't have to stop climbing to be a problem. The excess inflation, or the real inflation number, which I believe is 20 to 25%, has to start coming down. And those kinds of inflation numbers don't come down overnight. But here is the big statistic. Consumer sentiment plunged to a record low in June. Now, let's break this down for just a second. Consumer sentiment, this measures the confidence of consumers and their ability to spend money. So you want to see a positive consumer sentiment number. Yet it plunged to an all-new record low. This indicator dates back to the 70s. Now let's walk through this for a second. This is lower than the last time that we had inflation, which the inflation numbers were higher. I don't believe the real inflation number was higher, the one that the government doesn't compute, to the one in the 70s, because inflation today is a lot more complex than inflation in the 70s. This record low survived the 2000-2002 bear market, which 9/11 occurred, which consumer spending came down to a halt. And this is also lower consumer sentiment than the numbers of the financial crisis, 2007 to 2009. This is Bob Brooks, 1-877-913-5357. We'll taking a break. Stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show, 1-877-913-5357. I just got to thinking, it dawned on me, when we were taking our trip down memory lane and talking about how this consumer sentiment number is lower than what is at a record low, which is lower than, obviously lower than anything that's been released since the 70s. And thinking about lower than what took place during the tech bust, what took place during the financial crisis, and we are only roughly 7 months into this. We'll say almost 7.5 months into the market dropping and the bear market forming and all that kind of thing. And lower than during the financial crisis, That's just unbelievable to me. So the government announces job creation of 372,000 jobs. And it makes sense for them to create this optic because it would signal they want everyone to believe that there is and has always been strength in the economy so they can continue to raise interest rates. And for the consumer mindset, which you just saw in the numbers, record low in dating back to the 70s, is pretty heavily damaged as it is. But it really probably fascinates me more than anything to watch everything as it starts to come together, and then the reaction of the markets, the reaction of consumers, inflation, and then you have a record low. And I believe it was either 33%. I've heard 33%. I've heard 29%. But the bottom line is you have a record low approval rating for our president. Mix that in there. I think we'll look back in history at this time and just say there's never been a time like this. Of course, then again, I'm sure that people in the early 30s could say the same thing, which is true. There still has never been a time where we've suffered through a Great Depression, and that's fortunate. But it's getting interesting. Today, the markets were looking ahead a little bit to earnings reports. Now, what ends up happening, and this really is what drives the stock market. That is, companies come out, 4 times a year, 4 quarters a year, and they announce if they're going to be profitable, if they met the expectations of Wall Street for profitability, if they made money, if they lost money, and how do things look going forward. And there's going to be a couple of quarters, and this is at the heart of what drives Wall Street, earnings. Because, and I'll explain this the best way I can on the radio. It's a little bit easier to show it to you. If the stock market thinks earnings should be at, let's say, at 10, and earnings are really at 5, then the stock market has to fall and decline down to the point to where it's valued to be at 5. And there's the big gap. So we'll see, because I do believe earnings season starts this week. And besides, the market the last couple of weeks has been up. A down day just totally makes sense. The S&P 500 was down 1.15%. The Dow Jones was down 0.5%. The NASDAQ, not so good, down 2.26%. 1-877-913-5357. I had a very interesting story sent to me by a listener. And I bring this up because I think there's just so much to learn from this story. And it was about dealing with a debt collector, even dealing with the filing of a lawsuit. Now, this listener took out a loan, defaulted on that loan 3 months into it. And a debt collector at that point, they tried to collect the debt, couldn't. And then the debt collector, I guess at some point, gave up and sold the note. And this was back in 2017 or 16. And that's important to know and I'll tell you why. And once again, I tell you this so that you'll know that if this happens to you, you need to ask a lot of questions. recently, the owner of the debt, remember, a debt can be sold from, let's say, Citibank had the debt. You owed the money to Citibank. They tried to collect the debt. They got a third-party debt collector to try to collect the debt. Nothing worked. You wouldn't cooperate. So they take the debt and they write it off and they sell it to a debt buyer who becomes the owner of your debt. Well, this debt buyer, and by the way, you should always Google search any of these companies that call you and look for records and reports. And the word scam came up many times with this debt collector. And so what typically happens, and I didn't get a chance to check with an attorney about this. And besides, I'm not an attorney, nor am I trying to play one on the radio. Please keep that in mind. The debt collector took an envelope, put what looked like official papers into this envelope, no stamp on it, and put it in the listener's mailbox. Now, typically, those papers were supposed to inform the individual who had the debt that they were being sued. Now, most of the time when you get sued, the papers are served to you. It's a very official process. You've been served, and you find the court documents and all that kind of thing. But put it in an envelope. I'm not even sure you can do that. I don't know what the legality is of that. Anyway, and as long as I've studied debt and debt collectors, I've never heard of that happening. But here's the thing. Besides the odd series of events, the listener had proof of when he defaulted on the debt, had kept information, I think in the way of credit reports, that kind of thing, that stated all the facts, are enough to, in my opinion, to have a case. And it clearly showed that it had been beyond 4.5 years. I've heard attorneys say 4.5. The state of Texas, the statute of limitations is 4 years. Basically, that means they have 4 years that they can go back and sue you as a means of collecting a debt. Beyond 4 years, in the state of Texas, they can't do that. For some reason, I've never understood why. For some reason, some attorneys say 4.5. But he was clearly out of the statute of limitations period, but he didn't know that. So this company, this debt collector, never followed through with the lawsuit. Imagine that. But the point is I'm sure that, I mean, they sent in this note to, the attorney that was supposed to be representing him sent in this note all the things that could happen to him if he didn't follow through. I thought, whose side is this guy on? This is supposed to be his attorney. Anyway, probably the craziest thing that I've come across. And the attorney was willing to put him on a payment plan so that he could end up paying for the outrageous, I thought they were outrageous costs to represent him in a lawsuit that was beyond the statute of limitations. Go figure. You think the attorney would know that or would investigate that. And yet, I think he wanted something like, I don't know, I'm guessing, but it was a crazy number. And we were talking about it originally a $2,000 debt. So the bottom line is, the point I'm trying to make is check the details before you spend any money, before you do anything. My book, Deceptive Money, goes goes through all of the numbers and what you have to look for. You can find that at prudentmoney.com. This is Bob Brooks. You got a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time till we do meet again next time. Keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.